Welcome to the 2013 incarnation of the Sphinx tutorial. I gave it initially, I think, about 4 years ago, tweaked it in subsequent years, and then have nearly rewritten it for this year because I've been learning better and better what makes a tutorial work for students. So hopefully, those of you who have heard about it from friends will be able to go back and tell them that your experience was even more interesting, because I think we're going to pack a good bit more material in here than I was able to in previous years. Let me quickly outline what I'm intending to cover over the course of the tutorial, because it could be that some of you have come in with a need or a desire or something you need to get done that I hadn't even thought of. And it could be that if you mention it now and I have it in the back of my mind, that I can later in the class include at least a little 5-minute spiel on whatever topic you are interested in. So let me say that I'm kind of imagining this class as the material I have prepared is in 2 halves. Writing documentation, we will look at having it generated automatically, handcrafting it ourselves about how to think about tutorial introductions that people need to our software, and topical guides. And after that first half of the class, or it might run over into the second half, that's sort of the core. How do you write documentation using Sphinx? What are the mechanics? And then how might you think about organizing your documents? We're going to talk about deployments. Serving it as static HTML, having it hosted automatically on Read the Docs, hints, tips, and thoughts about storing it in version control, and then this year, for the first time, I am fitting in a segment on theming the HTML version so that it doesn't look terrible and misleading like the default theme does. If I cover those topics, will most of you have had hit sort of the basic topics that you showed up for? Are there any things that you guys had in your mind I would cover that you want to mention because you think it falls outside of this and I maybe should include a few minutes on something else? Sir?
Generating other output formats?
Besides HTML. And so when I say, I will go ahead, because actually I was going to, that was as we wrote, I was going to have us produce some different, but I should make that explicit. And I'll probably actually just do PDF, because that's the main other one people ask about. And once you know how to do that one, you will know the procedure for looking up and generating the other kinds. There's probably 1 or 2 other kinds I'll do, I just don't remember their names at the moment. Anyone else? Okay. Okay. I was going to say something and I can't remember what it is at the moment. So, this is your Sphinx tutorial handout. Yeah, the problem is that I'm holding theirs up as the example. Who will I be giving this to in a moment when I get done? All right, it will go to you. I will try not to get it messy. This is Brandon's Sphinx tutorial. The handout might actually be more useful if you rip it in pieces, which I would illustrate had there been an extra, but I'm not going to do it to his. I will leave it up to him. After the first 3 pages of opening, oh, wait a minute, no, it numbers them from 0. So let me say that page number, let's see, page number 9. So let me just take you through this, because this is going to be, I handcrafted this handout for the way that we're going to be going through the material today in the tutorial. And so I need, because this is a resource you'll be drawing on, especially if I've moved on to a topic that you're still confused about, let me briefly take you through the chapters. Chapter 3 is the basic outline of how you run Sphinx. It looks scary because the chapter is 7 pages, but if you will note, the actual instructions for running Sphinx actually only cover pages 3 and 4, and by the time you get to page 5, you're starting to get to the rest of the material, the fancier stuff that I'm going to teach you today. But I tried in the between pages 3 and 8, 3 and 7 really here, I tried to boil down all the major hints and tips I'm going to be giving you today so that besides the video that's being recorded, you will have a printed reference to the kind of things I'm telling you. Most of the back of the chapter is what you'll want to refer to later when you're trying to get all this to work. And, you know, tomorrow when you get home, you're trying to write some stuff. And of course, because I'm not there, it won't work. And this is how you can get back to my thoughts on the subject. Much more relevant for today is page 9. As you go through the tutorial, you might be tempted to and might decide to just carefully rip this page out so that you can have it sitting next to your other materials. This is a quick reference we're about to read through to how one types restructured text. Pages 11 and 12, a double-sided page that follows it, is also a, if you wish, rip-outable quick reference with all of the constructs you will need for our exercises today that are Sphinx constructs. And don't worry, I'll talk about what those two things are in a minute. I then, in chapters 4, 5, and 6, which are a single sheet of paper each, have some instructions that, with my jumping in and leading you through it as well, is going to help you today write the documentation on pages 19 through 24. Pages 19 through 24, I very carefully put the name example in front of the titles of each of those chapters. The 3 example chapters are documentation for a little library called Triangle Lib. I wrote it myself. And what you are going to be doing today is creating this little booklet, these 3 chapters, using Sphinx. And in fact, we'll probably be most of the way done by soon after the break. There is a break in the middle of the tutorial, which is especially nice if you're thirsty, need coffee, or have fallen behind, and I and the TAs, especially during that time where the TAs aren't talking over me, we can really help you catch up if you've if a technicality or something has caught you and made you miss one of the goals. So, the goal today is for you to learn a lot about Sphinx, to have a lot of fun, to learn a lot about deployment and about where you keep your docs and where you put your documentation so that people can read it. And the really concrete goal is for you right here, live on your laptops, to learn how to produce a little set of documentation like this. Now, I'll go ahead and I will admit what my error was in earlier years. Do you know what I did the very first time I gave this tutorial? I gave people Triangle Lib, and as I went through introducing the concepts of Sphinx, I would show them what it's like to write a tutorial, and then I would invite them to do it for Triangle Lib. Guess what they spent a lot of their time doing? Trying to figure out Triangle Lib and what it did. Trying to write. I mean, I guess I turned it into kind of an essay, a writing class. You started with a blank sheet of paper and had to just document this little module I gave you. And I mean, it is a very little module. Most people managed it. But I realized that that took people's focus off of the mechanics of Sphinx. What is it doing for me? How does it work? There were a lot of topics I couldn't cover because people spent all of their time trying to figure out how the module worked and think up words of their own. Sorry. To think up words of their own to describe it, which is tough. It can take all day to write a good little tutorial. And I realized that you'll learn the same Sphinx mechanics whether I provide the words or you do. You'll learn all the same mechanics if you just type in documentation I've already invented. So if you're especially creative, if you're a designer, English major, if you took Latin in high school, and you just don't like the constraint of writing up the Triangle Lib tutorial exactly as I have it here, feel free to go off program, write your own paragraphs, explain it your own way. Do try to reproduce all of the features, the code blocks and things I've put here, because that's what we're actually trying to learn. But if what you're here for today is to learn how Sphinx works, this is your goal. I've already written documentation for Triangle Lib, and you are going to each open an empty file in a minute. We're going to start, interestingly enough, with the last piece over on page 23. I'm going to start you. You're going to open api.rst, a blank file, and you're going to try to make this documentation appear from nowhere. I will note that, though I will be leading you through instructions for doing that, the 3 chapters we just skipped over on page 15, writing tutorial RST. Previous to that, page 13, writing API from RST. Oh, and then I guess right after that, 17, writing guide.rst. Pages 13, pages 15, and pages 17 are essentially our curriculum for the first half and part of the second half of the tutorial. And so what I have packaged here is the complete documentation for a little Python package and instructions for how to start with a blank file and make that documentation happen on your own. I have quick references to all of the syntax that I will be covering, and that's the first thing we'll go over in a minute. And so your goal, which is to produce the documentation, is going to be supported by the quick references that will let you remember all of the different Sphinx constructs I show you, by my own voice, because I will stand up, we'll open an empty file called api.rst together, and I'll start leading you through it. And that process I'm taking you through is written out for your current and future reference in Chapter 4, writing api.rst. So if you fall behind or want to go back through this whole process later, I essentially have the whole exercises part of the tutorial, including all the stuff I'll say as an instructor, in this document. Quick references for the syntax, these writing guides to help you understand how you go from an empty file to each of these 3 target chapters, and the target chapters themselves, so that you're not having to invent content off the top of your head, but so that you have a process for creating each of these documents. The reason I thought that you might want to rip this into small pieces and dismember it is because when you're writing api.rst, I would want to rip out the quick references, so they were on one side of my keyboard, and I would want to rip out the guide to writing api.rst and the text of api.rst to sit next to me, so that all of those things were in view, because the codex, the book, was a great invention. Scrolls required, essentially, if the passage you wanted to get to in a scroll was 30 meters down the scroll, you had to sit there and wind in order to reach. So random access of a scroll was like a disk drive, having to move a disk head back and forth, and it could take time. When they decided in the 1st and 2nd century to start chopping beautiful books, I mean, imagine the travesty. You're getting this book that's a continuous narrative, and you're slicing it into tiny pieces that they called pages. They turned literature from being something necessarily linear to something that you can just jump in right at the middle of whenever you want to. And that is an incredible invention. Maybe they were the first postmodernists, that you can enter the literature wherever you want to. You can just stick a finger in and get to it. So the codex is a great invention, but I would probably do the tearing, maybe because I really like Dead Poets Society. But this has in it your quick references to the markup we're about to go over. It has the guide to writing each of these chapters, and then it has the chapters themselves. And in a minute, we'll start learning how to get these chapters to appear on our screen. And there is your copy. Does everyone, by this point, and it's fine if you don't because I just put it up on the web, does everyone have Triangle Project unzipped, untar-gzipped onto their hard drive? And so if you don't, raise your hand because we have our helpful TAs. Could all of the TAs stand up and just say your name and where you're from so that the students, TAs? Are you a TA? I can't remember. And oh, okay. Well, say your name and where you're from so people know the host.
I'm Paul from Virginia, your hostess.
All right. And Sethel?
My name is Senthil.
Senthil.
I live here.
I'm Chris from Virginia.
All right, and whenever one of you guys gets hung up, but I need the class to move on, they will be the ones who come over and get things installed for you. Right now, everybody needs triangleproject.tar.gz uncompressed on your hard drive. And while Chris is doing that, I will say that in the beginning, so first, Sphinx is built on a plain markup language called restructured text. Markup, as you know, is any system of adding crazy marks to plain text so that they get formatted. This has been done from the early days of computing because what publishers want to appear on pages is far, far richer than what can simply be typed at a keyboard. So I will take the example that your keyboard can't do italic. Your keyboard, you can't hit it harder and have bold appear. Wouldn't that be fun if it was like really good synthesizers can tell how hard you're hitting the keys because a piano can? It would be kind of fun if you're banging away, it turns into bold and then goes to all caps if you hit it even harder. But keyboards cannot, in fact, include that dimension of formatting and emphasis. And so the very first people who had to produce printed documents from the computer invented markup, and the idea is that you would have some way to give the computer out-of-band information about the text. This is early in a very successful typesetting system called the Greek word, after the Greek word for technology, tech. Invented by perhaps the most famous computer scientist of them all, Donald Knuth, because his math papers looked so ugly, he stopped publishing. And for a year, went and invented a typesetting system that would make his math pretty enough. We will see it later today when we produce a PDF of our documentation. Sphinx uses Donald Knuth's text system and, in fact, writes thousands of lines that look exactly like this in order to produce the PDF of your Sphinx documentation. So markup was invented. We can't make words bold, but we can surround them with ugly characters that make them bold. And markup languages are ugly. Oh my gosh, and they're really terrible because if you tell someone, oh, but the web is simple. You can understand the technology because your browser exposes it to you. Why, you can just go to a website like google.com. Reader comes up. I must have been in mourning. Google is canceling Reader in July, if you hadn't heard, their RSS reader. You can, if you tell your friend, but you can learn how Google's homepage works. It's all delivered to your browser. Just press Control-U, and the source code will come up. Like, for example, there's a title in the middle that says Google. Well, that's right in here, isn't it? And what you'll find is that when someone first told you, oh, on the web we can make things bold, it's so simple. You just put B and some little brackets around it, your text will still be readable. You find that that quickly becomes false, and that in fact the number of angle brackets completely overwhelm the number of actual useful characters, and what we have is ugly. The first generations of markup for publishing, for typesetting, to add metadata to text were really, really ugly, because metadata means you have to designate certain characters as special. In tech, the curly brace and backslash are special and don't actually get printed on your printed document. In HTML, the person looking at Google's homepage doesn't actually see the angle brackets, and this introduced ugliness and this introduced noise. And so what happened was in the late 90s and early 2000s, people who were tired of having to make the compromise, is my text going to be pretty on the screen, or at least, let's say, at least readable on the screen, or is it going to be readable on the printed page in the browser? They decided to try to invent markup that actually reads as text as well. And the solution that was fairly widely adopted in all of these systems was to adopt conventions that already existed in email. For example, people for ages in email, when they weren't quite angry enough for all caps, or perhaps just not quite that rude, they would put asterisks around a word. And the people who started inventing these simple markup languages decided to just adopt conventions like that. How do we differentiate paragraphs? In HTML, you do it like this. In tech, you do it like this. Well, how do you differentiate paragraphs when you're typing an email? You just make a blank line. And so this grand idea was that, well, we can tell bold by the asterisks. What if we just separated paragraphs with a blank line, like we normally do when typing anyway? And thus, in the Python community, structured text was born, I believe, in the Zope project. Or I think it was it Jim Fulton who did structured text? Okay, oh, so the Perl guys had done it first. Okay. And it wound up being a little clunky and hard to extend. So someone with perhaps a bit of a lack of imagination when it comes to naming decided that they would name the second generation of it restructured text. Lowercase r, capital S, capital T. And one of the ugliest words that I've ever had the displeasure to have to type in computing. I, for the rest of this class, will name the files RST for restructured text, and thus I am going to call the whole markup system RST because I can type it and say it. So an ugly name, rather ironic that such a beautiful concept has such an ugly name. And again, who has heard of this word before? Was it the Ruby people that came up with Markdown? I know Daring Fireball is the website where it originated. Markdown is outside the Python community.
It was written by Aaron Swartz.
Who's he?
Aaron Swartz.
Who's he?
The internet activist who just passed away.
Oh, he invented Markdown? Okay. Was he from a particular programming language community or doing it as kind of an internet activist thing?
Many of his projects, this was one of his projects.
Okay, so not by a guy working like the Perl people or the Python people in a particular programming language community, but a person concerned with information in the internet more generally. Invented Markdown, and it is really the runaway favorite at the moment, because if you are typing a comment on GitHub, you can mark it up with Markdown. I believe Stack Overflow uses a version of Markdown for questions and answers. How many of you here have ever used Stack Overflow? It's a magnificent website. I will bring it up just for a moment here. It is a question and answer website where you accumulate points and reputation if your answers are voted up. This does two things. One, it creates addictions to helping other people. There are people who spend an hour a day because they can't resist the addiction of seeing if they can be in there fast and first with a good answer that gets upvoted. And second, the magic of that is that it then displays the answers in order of their rank. So the community, so if someone asks a Python question, and there's a good answer that's Pythonic and a bad answer that maybe works but is ugly and unPythonic, we go in and vote up the appropriate answer so that a few hours typically after a question is asked, there are not only several answers, but you know that the ones at the top agree with how the community thinks about answering that question. So it's a really, really great resource that a lot of us use every day when we have questions. It uses Markdown because, again, Markdown has become a big favorite. But we are Python people, and we use restructured text because it's similar, uses some of the same conventions, is more extensible, is better defined, and we have a lot of tooling built around it. There has, for a long time, been a module called docutils, which you can download and that can help you just get a single restructured text document and format it. And what, of course, we are here today to study is Sphinx. Sphinx has the docutils as a dependency. It uses the docutils. That is, docutils provides that ability to get a single restructured text file and format it as maybe a single HTML file. But what people needed, especially to write the Python documentation, which is what Sphinx was invented to do, is they needed to have whole systems of documents. Not a single restructured text document with a little tutorial in it or something, but a whole system of documents with cross-references and an index and all the rest. That is what Sphinx does. It is a build system that lets you create as many restructured text documents as you want, and it will knit them together into a single website, a single book, a single system of online, I think it can do Windows help files, where someone can bring up Windows help and click the hyperlinks and visit all the parts of your documentation. And so, that is why the quick reference that we're about to glance at is split into a chapter on pure restructured text features, and then a page of features that are particular to Sphinx, because Sphinx builds on top of this basic simple ability to mark up restructured text. So in a moment, we'll go over those quick references, but I've been talking for long enough, I can tell your fingers are itchy to type. So let us get them typing by opening and starting your very first Sphinx project. It's time to start making you guys to get actual abilities starting to flow out of your fingers. In the printed documentation, and I'm going to have to continue referring to this because my online copy doesn't have the, oh, I guess I could open it in PDF. Anyway, the page numbers. If you will go to page 3, I talk about how to start a Sphinx project. I will, this entire tutorial, including its printed material, is up for free on GitHub. For this sake of this tutorial, I'm not the kind of instructor that has, I haven't for this purpose copyrighted this material and told you you can't use it and told you you can't go back to your workplace and give this tutorial. If you want to go give the same tutorial or try at your workplace, if you want to use these materials at a local user group, if you want to go to a local school and teach kids how to write up their reports in this, you're welcome to use these materials however you want. I should go ahead and add a license this afternoon just to make that explicit. But all of this is for free up on GitHub, just like you have what's the chapter using Sphinx? Just like you have that chapter there, it is available. Again, this whole document is itself This is so meta. I did the Sphinx tutorial as a Sphinx document. If you want to see an example of anything that I got to print out on this set of pages, you can find it. But here in starting a Sphinx project is the process I use over and over again when I'm ready to start a new system of documentation. I'm going to go to my home directory, and I guess I will get myself in the same position you are by going into USB. I guess I'll just copy Triangle Project to my home directory and CD into it. Everyone else do the same. CD into the Triangle Project directory, and when you're there, and type dir if you're on Windows. Who here is running Windows today? And who is running Mac? And who is running Ubuntu? And who is running FreeBSD? Okay, so we're all one of the big three. And I like that the two Windows guys are back there where you can help each other, because I will often say things like, well, trivially, ls the current directory, and you guys probably already know from long experience to translate that to dir. Anyway, I'm glad that you guys are next to each other, so if we run into any Windows problems, we have both of you there to compare the working to the non-working state, unless you both break at once. And so, following the guide that is printed, it says, if you have installed Sphinx into a virtual environment, this is certainly the time to turn it on. If you installed it system-wide in your Python, then you're ready to go. Can all of you at this moment type Sphinx build and see a big several screen full list of options come back? My bet is that several of you did not just see that when you typed Sphinx build. By the way, is the font size legible to everyone, even in the back of the room? Do I have the bottom of it up high enough that it's not disappearing behind his head? Okay, good. If Sphinx build didn't just work for you, raise your hand so that I can vector a TA in your direction. This is going to be a good day, guys. Oh, yeah?
Sorry.
Yeah. It's not working?
No, I can't find the Sphinx tutorial.
I can help you.
Oh. Oh, you mean up online?
The Triangle Project, there's something else you needed me to download. Sphinx tutorial.
I am in, well, here, let's stop for a moment. Let me show you where I'm sitting on my file system. I'm in a directory called Triangle Project, and those are, so a moment ago I was saying that the whole tutorial material is up on GitHub in case you want to download it or look at it later, but you don't need it on your drive right now. All you need right now is this set of files. Do you have a
I do.
All right. In this directory, with that set of files visible, it is time for us to type Sphinx Quick Start, and I am going to call the documentation to this project doc. You might say, Brandon, why don't you call it Triangle Lib doc? And the answer is because I'm already sitting inside of the Triangle Lib directory. I'm planning to version control this, store it online along with the rest of the project. So everything in this directory is already part of the Triangle Lib project, so I don't need to qualify the name any further. That's a principle of API design generally. If you have an object that is a web object, you don't need to call its open method WebOpen. You can just call it open because Python, just like file systems have directories, Python has namespaces. And namespaces are a?
Great idea. Do more of them.
Was it just a great idea? Where is it? Namespaces are one honking great idea. As a Python person, you should always have that on the tip of your tongue. We should greet each other in the marketplaces and in the squares by saying, namespaces are. Let's do more of those. A file system is a namespace because the setup.py in this directory can be different than the setup.py in another directory, which means that file names don't have to be arbitrarily long to specify that they are the triangle project's setup.py and not some other project. You can't imagine the chaos back before directories were invented. It is now time to type Sphinx quick start, and I was about to give it the root path on the command line, but I should follow my tutorial where I simply run Sphinx quick start. And what I want you to do now, and just follow along on the piece of paper, is go through giving the answers that I recommend to each of the queries that it asks. If you get confused, it is always better to say yes than no. I will do the same. You can hit enter if you already like the answer that is in square brackets.
Do you have a copy of your tutorial, soft copy? With this gentleman? No.
Well, let me look. No, I was only given as many as there were, I think, students on the roster. Someone was probably a late sign-up or something. Well, not you. I meant if anyone was a late sign-up.
I got all the answers.
Would you be able? Would it be? I can show you. Want me to point you at the repo on GitHub so that you have in your browser the same documents that they're looking at on paper?
Sure.
Okay. Oh, but wait, that won't. I don't know.
People print things? There actually is a FedEx place down there.
Yeah, actually, so I'm thinking through it. Since the point of the exercise is going to be to produce the documentation that's on the paper, it would probably be good to get this guy next to someone else with, so who among you is just friendly, easygoing, good personality, easy to get along with, and if the guy sitting next to you comes and has to tilt the paper a little towards him so that he can read it for a moment, which of you doesn't have the temptation to suddenly go, What? Oh, we had an extra? Or you guys are going to share? Oh, that way no one needs to move around. Here you are, sir. All right, how many of you guys are now done with the quick start? It seems tedious, doesn't it? But in practice, you'll find that most of the answer, that is, once you've done quick start a few times, you will find that you hit enter through most of it because most of the defaults are reasonable, and that the only place you really pause are one, the questions without defaults. Like, what's the name of the documentation that you're creating? It can't guess, and so it provides it. It provides a prompt for you to type it. So you'll find that you kind of just blindly hit enter until a prompt comes up that keeps coming back as you hit enter, and so you'll stop and fill in a value. And then when it gets to kind of the Boolean question stage, when it's asking yes or no, you from experience will already know what features you want, so you'll just sit there hitting enter and hitting Y when you see the name of a feature you recognize. No, no, no. Oh, enter Sphinx. I need that one. Yes. No, no, no. Ooh, MathJax. Yes. And if you mess up, it's okay, because if you look, there should be a doc directory, cd into it, and you should find that there is now a little Sphinx project sitting here ready for you to start inventing and writing and typing. There is a conf.py file, which is big and voluminously commented. And if you look up near the top, open or list conf.py and look for extensions. Does anyone, and raise your hand when you've opened the file and found the phrase extensions inside of the file conf.py. If you've written Python before, and not everyone at PyCon has, if you've written Python before, you'll recognize that this file is a Python file using Python syntax, and you will see that extensions is a list of strings. Can you guess where that list of strings came from? It is exactly the modules that you just answered yes to. If you accidentally say yes to the wrong module and no to the wrong module, you can just edit this list and make the change. Another trick I use is if I answered my yes and no's and started working and then realized that I'd wanted to answer them differently, I just go into a blank directory, Sphinx quick start a new blank doc directory to which I give the correct answers, and then run diff on the two conf.py files to copy across the one setting that my different answer has tweaked or changed. You'll sometimes find that that diff is a little larger than you'd think because maybe Sphinx has grown up to a new version in the meantime, but you should be able to look through the diff and deduce, okay, I think these 2 or 3 things are just because Sphinx now has more options. But you'll probably from the name recognize the line that you want to change to make your project start behaving as though you answered differently. All quick start exists for, essentially, is to set up this little directory structure and write a conf.py for you, because early users hated that the way to start a Sphinx project was to create a directory, create this file, create that file, okay, conf.py. Go in and create an extensions variable, and here's the list of things you can add to it, and it was very inconvenient. I should mention, in case any of you guys design systems for people to use, that what we have just done is absolutely incredible and a huge innovation in how people use computers if they're going to be creating and programming. A lot of websites are written today using something called Ruby on Rails because they were the first people to create essentially a quick start for a web application. Most other ways of writing on the web had readmes and getting started guides that were 20 pages long. Who here has ever had to open a readme and go through 20 steps to get some piece of software installed and configured? Who has ever had to do that for the Solaris? Oh, never mind. For the thing that really got me was the Solaris IPsec module installed back in the late 2000s. It had about 40 or 50 steps in it. Edit this system file, change this system file's permission, restart the machine, go to this other place. When I finished those 20, no, in that case, about 40 or 50 very complicated steps, was IPsec up and working on my machine? It was not. Which of those steps did I do wrong? I couldn't tell. Because if someone gives you 40 steps to do at the same time, you're going to get to the end of them, it's not going to work, and any of the 40 steps, or 2 or 3 of the 40 steps, could be the ones that are broken. And so, as computing has moved from the 90s into the 2000s, people started getting rid of processes that require you to dangle out several steps into the future before you learn if your foot has landed or not. People started, for instance, test-driven development, where you started a working state, you break it slightly by writing a test, and then you pull yourself back up to a working state by writing a few lines of code or changing a few lines of code to satisfy that test. If during that process I break a bunch of other tests, can you guess which lines of code are probably at fault? The 3 or 4 lines that I just wrote. If I write 50 lines of code at a time, which one could be the reason that my program isn't working? Any of the 50. And so, as I have got, when I was a kid, I used to try it because I didn't know what I was doing. No one knew what they were doing. And so most people would write, 20 lines of code at a time, and then they would do a horrific process that is called debugging, where you don't know which line is at fault, and you have to spend half an hour dodging through the 20 lines of code you just wrote, trying to determine what line is at fault. What do I do today? I start a function, and I put a print statement in it. And then I run to see if I can run that function and get the message to appear. I then add 1 line of code that downloads the data I need, and I add a print statement to say its length and whether it actually got it, and I run the function. I then add the line of code that parses the HTML response as Unicode, and I add a print statement, and I run it. If I then write the line of code that tries to split the file by CSV, and the print statement shows me I'm getting a mess out, which line of code is probably at fault? That one or the 1 or 2 before it. I now make tiny, tiny little steps forward, testing at each moment whether I have swerved from the righteous path of correctness into error. Because if my steps are this big, how far off the righteous path can I be at any given moment? This far. If I instead take 20 steps and then try running my program, I can be a long way from correctness with no idea about which steps are wrong. So I encourage you, as we start going through this documentation writing process, take it in small steps. Write a little bit, rebuild, and look to see if what you just did comes up on the screen like you'd want. And I am going to go ahead and generate this documentation without even taking my first step, because this is what's so magical about a framework that has a quick start. Instead of it putting a basic working state 20 steps away from you, so there's a big, tall install document, and I have to set up 10 or 20 files and get the syntax just right before I'm even at square one, where a blank web page will come up or whatever. A quick start process starts you in that working state that you want to be in. Sphinx Quick Start creates a complete enough set of documentation that it will compile. And so let us convince ourselves of that by, before we type anything, on Unix, I'm going to type make HTML, and I think the Windows guys might be able to type the same thing. Let's all try it and see. No, I CD'd into doc. So notice, by the way, that my shell prints my current directory over on the right. I hope that that will help you guys, now that I've pointed it out, from getting lost about the fact that everything I do for the rest of the day pretty much is going to be in the doc directory in this little project that I've set up and created. Did it work for everyone? Look.
Command not found.
All right.
That's fine.
Raise your hand if that did not work. Does everyone who needs one have a TA of their own? All right. What this did is that inside of a previously empty directory called build, there are now two systems of information. There's something we won't really look at called doc trees, which is where Sphinx puts some intermediate information as it builds the index to your document. But the thing that we are interested in is build/HTML. Inside of it, there is a website. What does that website look like? You can, if you want, open the raw file on your hard drive, but what I usually do is I run Python and I tell it to run its simple HTTP server. Who's ever done this before? And so the rest of you are in for a treat. If you've ever wanted to share data with other people on the LAN with you, or ever wanted to look at some files on the disk as though Apache were serving them up, Python comes with an HTTP server built in. Now, simple HTTP server is in fact a library with an API that you can import into your Python programs and use. But since the code was sitting there, they also made it where if you run it as a module, it starts up an HTTP server on your machine, serving the current directory and the files beneath it to the world. Now, it's just kind of a toy web server. Don't run it at DEF CON on the LAN there. Don't use it to serve production files at your workplace. Don't go back to Oracle or wherever you work and use this for a website and come crying to me later when it winds up not being up to the job. But it does mean that I can now go to localhost. Let's see, mine grabbed port 8000. And go into build, go into HTML, and up comes the blank documentation for my project that is ready for me to type into. Isn't it ugly? I hate this theme. That's why theming comes in the second half of the class after the break. Actually, you might want to open a second terminal and just leave the simple HTTP server running, if that's how you choose to look at your built docs. But what I'm imagining for the next few minutes is this. After I quickly go over after we read over the quick reference together, I am going to ask you to use what you learned in the quick reference to try writing the little tutorial up. And it's fine that you won't do a good job, and it's fine that you won't find all the features at first, because after letting you do it for a few minutes, I'll jump in and start showing you how I would do it. But it turns out, and this is an important, in case you guys teach classes or even just help explain something at your workplace, people tend to remember things that are an answer to a real question they have. If you stand up and tell someone how to make something bold, they'll nod their head. If you challenge them to make something bold like it is on a piece of paper, and they're looking at the quick reference and looking at their file and trying to make it bold, and then you tell them it's asterisks, they will remember, because it's actually a relevant question if they're attempting. The important thing about exercises isn't that you succeed, it's just that you try. Just by trying, you're making your brain value the answer, and what I teach you in this tutorial today becomes much more likely, the education experts tell me, than if I just sat up here and read off the answers to you. So what I imagine is that you might have an editor open where you start editing the tutorial file that we're about to create. I imagine that you might have a terminal window open where you type make HTML, you add a few lines and type make HTML to see how they look. That you might have simple HTTP server running off in the background or on a terminal window you leave behind the other windows. So that, and I'll show you the process in a moment, so that you can edit, save, build, view. I like that. Edit, save, build, view. No, I don't like that. Change it. Edit, build, view. And I'll show you that process in a second. It's kind of the loop that I sit in all day if I'm writing documentation. So the first step, now that we've learned about building, and now that you have a mechanism for bringing this up, is that we're going to start our tutorial. We'll do this in 2 steps. I'm in the wrong. I'm going to go ahead and use my editor here with the huge font because I think that that will be more useful to you. So what is the directory call that I'm sitting in? Triangle project / doc. The directory looks like this. There's already an index.rst. Everyone bring up your favorite editor of choice and raise your hands so that I can get a TA to you. Where are the TAs? Oh, there you are. Okay, good. And I can, so I will come help you if you don't know how to run an editor on your platform. But open a fresh file called API. I'm sorry, I said tutorial before. Open a fresh file called api.rst, and you're almost ready to begin following those instructions I wrote out for writing an API for the first time and making that API chapter at the end of your handout magically appear from nowhere. But before you do so, let's quickly go over the what did I call the the quick references. I'm going to hop back over here into my handout. I didn't think about formatting this where it was wide enough, but that's okay. You have the printouts behind you, in front of you, and I'm just using this for reference. The quick RST page shows you how we put funky punctuation around things in order to make it appear different than plain text. In restructured text, you can always just type text, and the text will appear in the output. This is what you do if you want it to look different or special. Italic is a single asterisk surrounding the word or phrase. Bold is a double italic. It's a double asterisk surrounding it. You can make things appear like they're a variable name or a function name by putting double back quotes. You can even do whole expressions with spaces in them. Hyperlinks have 2 styles. One looks kind of like an email address where you have whatever text you want that's, pretty, like Brandon Rhodes, and then in angle brackets, brandon@rhodesmill.org, the technical version of the same text. You make those by putting an underscore after the little backticks, because that, to the guy who invented restructured text or structured text, it looked like an arrow pointing. And so, yes, that's what you have to think. It looks like it goes somewhere when it has that underscore swooshing off the end of it. And the other way you can do it, if you don't want to, especially if you're using the same links many times in your document, and you don't want to have to paste it in over and over again in angle brackets, is that you can just name the link and put the little swoosh at the end, and then have a comment. This is a comment where you put ... at the beginning of a line, and have a matching swoosh, a matching underscore with the same name. So if the link is named link, then the URL should be named link so that it becomes a hyperlink. You will see soon that you can do images. You can use the double dots for just a comment block to remind yourself of something that doesn't get printed in the output. And please be looking at your printout, because this is, actually, okay, never mind. I will fix me rather than, so the problem with you following along right now is I'm in too big a font size, so the lines are looking really ugly. but good grief, Brandon, I can solve that just by opening Sphinx tutorial, handout, quick restructured text. And it's a little smaller, but there. Now it's, for those of you that now want to follow along on the screen, hope that makes it less painful. Paragraph is one or more lines of unindented text separated by blank lines. Block quotes look like paragraphs, but like block quotes in books, you indent them with some white space. And again, when existing conventions that just look good already existed, restructured text adopted them. Since people make block quotes by indenting, you can just indent a paragraph and it becomes a block quote. You can put pipe characters in front of lines that are like a poem or something like that, where you want to control the line breaks. That's what putting a pipe at the beginning of a line does. You can have little definition lists by putting a term that's left indented, but then indenting a paragraph right beneath it with no intervening white space. You can use asterisks or 1 or A or whatever, and indentation to make a list. And then finally, code blocks. If they are normal code blocks, the only way you can help restructured text tell them apart from paragraph is by putting a double colon at the end of the paragraph right above them. But if they are doc tests, restructured text can tell that no real paragraph in a book would start with greater than, greater than, greater than. So those code blocks are detected automatically. And again, the reason these are on paper in front of you is I'm just going through the menu of options you have. It's in a moment that we will start using them to write a document. And in the quick Sphinx document, I start by showing you that a comment can actually cover several, not a comment. So here, I use the dot dot at the beginning of a line, and I say, I create, this is called a directive. You're about to see several of these. Yes, this is the page after the quick reference to RST, the quick reference to Sphinx. You can have a directive. Again, he had to add some punctuation around it so he would never mistake your innocent text for being a Sphinx directive. So you start the line with dot dot space, and then you have the name of the directive followed by Sphinx's favorite punctuation character, the double colon. And here, if I say note, and then have some indented paragraphs, have you ever seen in the Python documentation where it says note and has a box with some special text in it? This is how it's created. You can also, there are also directives that we'll see in a few minutes for making a code block, and you can tell it how to syntax highlight it. If you've ever had to cut and paste code from a Python file into your documentation, Sphinx absolves you of that responsibility by having a literal include directive, where instead of having to do it the old way, going into example.py, highlighting lines 10 through 20, hitting copy, moving over and hitting paste into your document, restructured text just lets you tell it to inline those 10 lines of the file, maybe even emphasizing some of the lines with highlighting with the literal include directive. We're about to see how these, yes?
With that, does that mean that if the file you're referencing changes, you're responsible for going and updating this reference as well?
Yes, and it makes your documentation dependent on an external file, and so you should probably only take this option if you version control your docs with your source code so they're always in the same relative position, or if you and your other documentation folks have a setup script you always run that always checks out the source code and the documentation so that the relative paths will always work. Good question. Gold star. There's a few more things like how to introduce the documentation to modules, classes, methods, and attributes, which we are about to learn about by writing an API doc. So I will skip over those since they're just there for your later reference. This is a reference sheet. And then we'll learn how to do test code, test output, and finally to label things so that we can have hyperlinked cross-references all through our documentation so that if your tutorial mentions a class, they can just click on the name and be shuttled over to your API documentation. So I wanted to quickly read over those quick reference sheets so that we all would know what's there. But the real trick now is we're going to learn when to pull each of those features out into this text file we're going to start reading. I want you to go to the blank file that I want you to have now open in your editor, api.rst. I want you to look at the API doc, the example API doc, bound in near the back of, it's actually the last chapter, I think, in your handout. I want you to try to make the title of the document appear by taking the pattern for a title that you just saw in the quick reference and adding it to the text file. Huh?
Which one? Which document? Is this one?
Page 23. I'm going to knock Stu over the head for not getting, I mean, I know it saves money to not give oh, I guess I could solve it by printing out my own copy before I left home. You see the pattern that I have. I keep trying to blame things on other people, and I always have to stop and take a deep breath and realize that there's probably a way I could have solved the problem on my own. All right, what I just did, or what I am going to do, what is the title of the chapter? Ignoring the fact that I put example at the beginning of the name. Someone read it to me.
The triangle lib API reference.
The triangle lib API reference. I glanced at my quick reference and said, the quick reference says that titles have dashes or equal signs under them. Well, this is the title of the whole document. It's up to you what punctuation you want to use. I'm going to use equal signs because it looks more important. And I have just written my first piece of restructured text. I have written text that will be readable if someone just opens this plain text file and looks at it. Right? I mean, you can read that. If someone sent you a text email and it said this at the top, how many of you would understand that that's probably supposed to be a title with an underline under it? Yet, it is also machine readable, machine parsable. So what is about to happen when we type make HTML? The answer, of course, is that we will get an error, because that's always what happens when you try something the first time. I typed make HTML, and it said up there under checking consistency, home Brandon Triangle Project doc API.rst, warning, document isn't included in the table of contents. It's warning me that when someone lands on the first page of my documentation, they're not going to be able to get to that. Are they right? Let us go. I can't hit reload because violating my own instructions, I did not leave the web server running. So I'm going to open a terminal, go to Triangle Live Project, cd to doc, Python, simple HTTP server and camel case, because it was the 1990s, it was a crazy time. And now, port 8000 has a web server on it, and my gosh, look at that. The warning was absolutely correct. Someone landing on the first page of my site will have no idea that there is an API doc there. So I am going to go into the document. I'm going to go to that other RST file. Our documentation at the moment only consists of 2 of them. And I'm going to bounce over to index.rst. And I see, in fact, that the table of contents tree is completely empty. I had better fix that. Open index.rst. Find that little TOC tree beneath the word contents. It tries to make it obvious for you. And add, you don't have to put the extension. Sphinx understands that your files are going to have the RST extension. Indented, because Sphinx knows the table of contents is over when the indentation is over, at the same level of indentation as the max depth directive put API. Go back over. Remember, we take little steps and then we build to see the result. You should go back over. When you type build, you should not see an error. And then when you hit reload, you should now find that without your lifting a finger, the actual entire title of the API doc has been copied over into your table of contents. This is starting to show you that unlike the old, oh, good grief. Someone should have said something. There we go.
Can you show your index.rst?
Yeah. My index.rst, there it is, back on the screen. So where was I before I was thinking about making the font the right size? So you can see that, whereas earlier documentation tools in Python just worked on single files, Sphinx knows that your set of files are a group, and so it can do things like automatically copying the full title of one document into the content of another, because what does that mean? They will always match. Earlier documentation systems I used made me spell out the triangulib API reference over in the table of contents, and what did that mean? It meant the documentation looked great, till the first time I changed the title of that document, and all of a sudden I had a table of contents that didn't match my document anymore. Sphinx, because it handles all of the documents as a single unit, is able to keep cross-references, and this is a cross-reference. It's clickable. If you click on it, you should be sent over to your so far blank, well, except for its title, triangulib API reference document. And at this point, I am ready to set you loose on the little guide to writing the API documentation. I just need to say, I was going to say one thing, but I'll say two. And this will be your first little exercise, and then we'll take a break. The first thing that I will say, I wasn't planning on doing this at this point in the tutorial, but I'm sorry. I am overwhelmed by the ugliness. We have got to learn at least enough theming to get rid of this horrible, horrible, ugly blue theme, because it is not only horrible, it is evil and misleading. I will show you that it is evil and misleading. Let me go over quickly. You don't have to copy this. I'm going to say section 1 and put dashes under it, and I'm going to say section 2 and put dashes. How did the dashes appear magically? Because Emacs is magic and it knows restructured text. And like all things in Emacs, it gives me a keyboard shortcut for adding them. Now that I have two sections to my document, if I come to the table of contents after typing make HTML and rebuilding, note that it now actually lets people jump directly to the subsections, even though they're just parts of a single HTML document. I guess I should show you if I create a subsection and give it some other, I'm just making up the punctuation characters I use. You don't have to use the same ones. As long as it sees punctuation under a title, Sphinx understands it because it's friendly. You'll note that if I build it with a third level and hit reload, what happened? It didn't provide a direct hyperlink to the third level. The reason is because the default index.rst has this little max depth option in it, because it turns out if you have very deeply nested documentation and give people a table of contents that includes all of the second and third and fourth level titles, they will be afraid of your product and will run screaming and will not use it because it looks too complicated. And it becomes too hard to navigate because they have to scroll and scroll and scroll just to reach the second chapter. So this directive is adjustable. I can change max depth to 3, make HTML again, and the subsection now appears. But it's up to you whether you want to leave that at the default, move it up to 3 or 4. You can even move it down to 1, and you'll only get a series of links to your chapters themselves. So why did I do that? I did that so that I can show you that this default theme is evil. If we click on the triangulib API reference, and we arrive here, Read these words to me. This is interactive because, not because I have aspirations to be Mr. Rogers. Not because I think that you are children. I'm asking and inviting you, you don't have to. I'm inviting you to respond because the education theorists tell me that that makes you actually remember in many cases that you would not. It's interesting that the way we've structured our society, where education ends at a certain age, 18 or 22, means that some people feel insulted if an instructor tries to use effective pedagogy, because subconsciously we think that only children really need to learn anything. So I'm going to ask questions. Feel free to shout out an answer and help yourself learn faster. But I'm doing that because of research, not as any insult or because I think it's cute or makes me Mr. Rogers or anything. So what does this say? Previous topic. And what is beneath it? The previous topic. What does this say? And what is beneath it? Wrong! Yeah, and I've just violated the other great rule of pedagogy. No one's going to answer a question now that I set you up and made you all wrong. Does not the primitive and evil visual formatting and graphic design of this page lead you to expect that just as previous topic is a title which names the thing beneath it, that this is the title table of contents that names this block of information? Who thought that when they first saw this documentation? Who has on numerous occasions been vastly confused because I'd do a Google search on some product I'd heard something good about, arrive in the middle of their documentation, like at their API docs, and I would say table of contents. The API reference, section 1, section 2. Oh, I guess they don't have a tutorial. I guess they don't have any topic guides to help me understand. I guess I want to visit the rest of their documentation. Oh, that link just went to the same page. Oh, that link just jumped me to another place in the same page. And I would go away sad from this evil and undocumented project that I had landed on because they only had a table of contents that took you back over and over again to the same page. In fact, table of contents is a link back. It is not a title. It is a link back to the table of contents of the document where all of the documents we're about to write and their sections will appear. So I'm telling you this because I have numerous times missed most of a Python documentation, Python project's documentation because I thought table of contents was the name of this internal table of contents of the document and not, as it always is, a link back to index.html. So that's why this is evil, and that's why for the sake of this screen that I have to look at, you don't have to do this yet, I'm going to open conf.py. I'm going to go down to the options for HTML output to the HTML theme and change it to haiku. If you want to open conf.py and set HTML theme, you may, but you can also just watch me. I type make HTML. And I get out documentation that actually doesn't include the internal hyperlinks to the page because I always find them confusing and thus is much easier to use. And so here we are back at the triangle lib API reference. We have a few minutes before the break. And what I want you to do is to follow. I've tried to make the instructions very explicit where you're not going to have to look directives up by yourself. If you go to the chapter where I describe writing the API docs. Is that actually what I called the chapter? For those of me. So you'll want two things right now. I have, of course, at the end of the document, the example triangle lib API reference, which is the goal that we're moving towards. But then earlier in the document, I have writing API.rst, your guide to making this chapter appear on the page. So what I want you to do is you'll see that by putting the title, by putting the title, the triangle-lib API reference up at the top of my document, I have already got you started. I'm going to shut up for a few minutes until I come back forward and call for a break, and I want you to just see how far you can get in following those instructions to make API.rst appear. Remember, stop every now and then and try recompiling to see at each step what is really appearing in your document. And even if you don't understand everything at first, the experts say that the mere act of just typing will start getting your fingers used to restructured text, because it turns out they have to learn it separately from your conscious cognitive brain. So I'm going to walk around and help those that I can. I invite the, what are they called? TAs to do so as well. Let's walk around for about the next 5 minutes as people start through this process and help people that we see are hung up on an error or something that won't compile, or if Python refused to start the web server for them or something. When I cut and pasted into the documentation, this of course is the terror of having untestable documentation and why I will show you doc tests in about 40 minutes. But because I could not run my documentation through a test as I went through doing this process before you, some of you noticed that I had pasted in to the docs the instructions to say auto doc member order, and I apologize, those of you that tried running it got a key error because there is no such directive. And so I went and looked it up, and it is in fact member order. If you, what does it do by default? Was it alphabetizing for those of you? And that's annoying because often the more complicated things are at the bottom of a file, but might alphabetically sort near the top. So your API doc starts with the hardest things you can do, like area. That's such an abstract concept compared to the side of a triangle. And that is an error in the docs, that it's member order that you say if you want Autodoc to try to use the order that the functions or methods are actually described in the file, rather than alphabetizing them to make them pretty. Let's see, did it work or not? It did not work for me. I will look that up, huh?
It worked for me.
Awesome. I will look that up later. And it worked for you having both a member's directive and a member order?
Yeah, I
Okay.
had the value for member order. I said member order : by source. And that seemed to work.
Oh. So it's a directive that takes an argument. Look at that. Now the really, really complicated things like area and scale that creates a whole other triangle. The really conceptually difficult ones are now at the bottom like they are in the file. Thank you. And I apologize for the fact that I remember figuring this out and thinking, oh, this is good. I should copy this into the documentation. And apparently I copied the word that is next to it in the Sphinx documentation. The Sphinx documentation, I should note, I always just look up Sphinx Python, because if you just look up Sphinx, first you get the statue in Egypt. Second, you get the very popular full-text indexing engine called Sphinx. And only if you put Python in the name do you make it narrow enough to bring the actual Sphinx documentation project to the top of your search results, which you will note does not use the default Sphinx theme, because the default theme is what? It's evil. It confuses people. It is unnavigable. It is visually inconsistent. And so like earlier, and this is a trick I will share with you, when a student first a few minutes ago ran across the fact that I had misspelled the directive in my instructions, I thought, well, what's the real name? Well, I should go into Sphinx's documentation, because of course Sphinx is documented with Sphinx documentation, and I should find that extension. How do you find an extension in the Sphinx documentation? I've had to do it many times. I will show you. You come to Sphinx.org, and I guess I always just at the top select Docs. you get a table of contents. If you search using your browser's in-page search, I've hit on my browser Control F so that I can type in a word and type in AutoDoc, then the, oh, actually in this case it came up, but it does not actually appear. What you get is the little tutorial on it, not the actual docs. It turns out that you have to type extensions. Because remember that little directive I showed you that controls how deeply your table of contents is willing to nest? Guess what the Sphinx documentation did? It created a chapter called Sphinx Extensions with a section called Built-in Sphinx Extensions. And so if you want the documentation for any of those extensions you were answering yes or no to as you went through those questions during the quick start, they are subsections of the Sphinx documentation and thus do not appear in the table of contents because they left the table of contents limit at 2. And so I'm going to click on Sphinx Extensions, and they actually here have the built-in Sphinx Extensions section that actually has links to AutoDoc, AutoSummary, DocTest. So as I'm going to show you a few different extensions, and we're going to mention them today, remember that you can get to their documentation. You have to go through a level of indirection. Just look up the part of the Sphinx docs on extensions, and there will be links there to their documentation. I got here, I scrolled down, and I found that it was down here that I had meant, once I finished getting it working in my copy, I meant to paste member order as the directive you use, and I accidentally cut and pasted this value instead, which doesn't work. But this was a good excuse for showing you the Sphinx documentation, because this is where you'll go, of course, when my docs that I've handed you, my quick references, kind of run out and you need some more detail. This is where you'll go to look things up. It might seem really weird that half the directives you're learning happen to be restructured text directives and half of them happen to be Sphinx. Unfortunately, that is also how they are split up here. The Sphinx docs, I'm back up at the top level now, have both a restructured text primer with the kind of things on it, the kind of markup that's in my first quick reference I gave you, and then specifically Sphinx markup constructs, which will have more detail and more options for that second little quick reference I gave you. So this is where you'll go when you're done today doing it on your own and want to find the real documentation. So far today, we have gotten a single file up and running, api.rst, and you are each partway into getting it full of rather useful information. I think you have now all gotten to the point of doing a build and seeing that without your having to type a single thing, there's already quite a bit of information in there that it is pulling, in case you didn't see, I'll show you, which it is pulling from here it is. I moved it up to here, which is pulling from TriangleLib. So if you notice here that the TriangleLib API reference says routines for working with triangles, you'll find that in the dunder init, routines for working with triangles, here at the top of the package. And then as you pulled in the modules beneath it, if you got to that point in the instructions, then you saw that documentation started showing up for the classes, the methods inside the classes, and the functions in this Python module. And so you kind of, if you have a well-written, well-documented Python package, you get the API docs for free. Is that useful? The Python documentation people say no. They were so excited when this was invented. They got the standard library docs, started rebuilding them on top of Sphinx. And when they did that, they said, great, well now we don't have to write docs for the RE module anymore. We can just tell AutoDoc to pull in the beautiful doc strings that we have defined for all of these functions and methods. They ran it, and they found that the output needed some tweaking, and then some more tweaking, and then some more tweaking. And then they realized that it just shouldn't be pulled from the code at all. That the code, when you add doc strings to your code, it needs to be very short, pithy, concise, because it's what's going to come up in the tooltip of the person's IDE when they start typing is triangle. And that is just not how you write docs that get printed on paper, that get put on the internet as pages. And so I believe that there is no part of the Python documentation at the moment that uses AutoDoc. It is for smaller projects, and my general rule is you need API docs, and we'll talk in a moment about what people use them for. You need API docs, and it's start by using AutoDoc. And if that works for you, and if you and the other people using your API are happy, stick with it. Because it's great, it's automatic, and it automatically stays in sync with your code. But a lot of big projects have actually found that if you paste together all of the doc strings into something bigger, it doesn't add up to something coherent. That you actually need for a big project handwritten docs with extra text that link the concepts together for the person sitting and reading through it. And so feel always, when you run AutoDoc, do it as an experiment. And if the results aren't adequate, that means you can either go and add more to your doc strings until you like the result. But it could just mean that yours is not a project that it'll work well for. And the instructions, if you'll look at, if you've been going through the further instructions for building this API.rst file, you'll note that I have you take progressively more control from AutoDoc and bring it into your own hands, because very often you will find that AutoDoc is okay for listing the methods, but that you really want to put some more introductory text up, say, at the top of triangle. And if you look at the instructions, you'll see that I tell you how to, in your API.rst, both do things like, initially, I was just saying auto module triangle shape, and the triangle class got pulled in without my asking. And the docs were just module doc string, and then the class that was inside of it. And the instructions that you have in your printout go into more detail than I can do on the screen right now about the process of backing down off the edge of the cliff, pulling away a little bit from the letting AutoDoc be in full control, and setting up just a normal module construct inside of which you then, or immediately after which, you can give it maybe control over the class, or maybe even not give it control over the class, move to fully manual mode, where if the class is going to have any documentation, you're going to need to provide it because it starts out blank, and where you just start typing about the triangle class, and so a student actually already noticed when he was following the instructions that you need to indent methods beneath it, because just like in Python, indentation is how you group things together that belong together. Most Sphinx docs, when you're writing the tutorial or the guide, they just stay at the left margin, except maybe for blocks of code. It's in your API docs that indentation will really bite you. But if you indent consistently with methods beneath the class, then magic happens, because foo, and now we'll get to see if this actually works. My claim is that because foo is indented beneath triangle, my claim now is going to be that Sphinx knows that foo is a method of triangle and will put it in the index as triangle.foo. Live demos. They will be the end of me, and it gives an error. Error in class directive. Members is what you say to Autodoc to get it to include the methods. It's not what you say to the good old-fashioned non-auto, hit Control P in the wrong window, rebuild. At least this time it did it without error. I reload. I see I have my triangle class and my foo method. If I go, I guess back to my contents and go down to my index, foo is a triangle lib dot shape dot triangle method. And okay, it happens that, and so you can see that because I used module, like modules are so big, they don't make you indent beneath a module, but they do want you to indent inside of a class. And you can see that because I put my method inside of my class through indentation, Sphinx was able to follow the logic that inside of this module lives this class, inside of this class lives this method, and so other parts of the documentation are able to link consistently to it. So there's great stuff there if later you go back through all of the details in that guide, and it'll lead you to do some fun things, taking more and more control over your API docs. But for now, I want us to step back and turn this into a complete system of documentation by adding the tutorial and by adding the little one-page guide. Are you guys looking forward to typing in the tutorial? Look at the example tutorial. It's third to the last chapter, I think. What page is it on, someone?
I think it's 15.
15. No, okay, that's the instructions for writing it. Where is the thing itself? The example. Oh. Again, right at the end of your doc, the last four, starting on page 19, is the documentation we're trying to create for the triangle module. It consists of a tutorial, chapter 7 here, a guide, chapter 8, and then an API reference that here is called chapter 9. I want you to create tutorial and the guide. Does that sound like fun? Are you looking forward to typing all of this in? In the directory that you copied from me, is there a directory, and this is a real question, I hope it's there. Everyone look, is there a directory inside of Triangle Project called texts? Please raise your hand if there, I'll do it this way. Raise your hand when you found it. When you found the texts directory by doing ls ... or looking in the folder. How many files does it have in it? What are they called? What do you think is inside of them? Who do you think doesn't hate you as much as you think? What I did, because I thought, I can't expect these guys in a 3-hour tutorial and the time limit to type all of this in. I got the text, once I had these chapters formatted, I copied the text and took out all of the markup. Because the point of this is for you to experiment and start learning some of the markup. So in my system, I would do this. I would say copy, and do this with me. Copy texts tutorial.text to tutorial.rst. You can also do this using your GUI, your file manager, and get texts guide.txt and turn them here in your doc directory into guide.rst. Quick quiz. What will happen right now? What warning might I see if I type make HTML? It's not in the table of contents. It will still compile them. They will still be there, but they won't be able to get accessed. Warning. Document isn't included in any table of content tree directive. So after copying those files in index.rst, you can say tutorial and guide, and at that point, you should be able to do a make HTML. Oh, okay, and it will complain. Oh, interesting. Okay, we will do this live. This is a fun message. Remember how I said it was great that Sphinx by default brings the title across? If it can't find a title, it decides that it just can't table of content index your document. And of course, what did I do to these documents before turning them into .text? I took out all of the markup. So now I will get to illustrate for you what you're going to be doing for about the next 20 minutes just to get you used to doing markup. You're going to go into these unmarked up documents, and you're going to start using your quick reference and making guesses and running make HTML and seeing what works and what doesn't. You're going to go in, and in this case, I'm going to add an underline under what in the printed copy I can see is the title, but isn't a title yet in restructured text. Actually, I will use equal signs. And then I am also going to go into guide.rst and use equal signs. And now when I type make HTML, I hopefully, if I've done that correctly, won't get an error. I'll hit reload, and I will now see that these two documents are available. Very little of it can tell the doc tests because they have 3 chevrons, but it doesn't know any of the other content. What I'm going to do for the moment is I'm going to set you loose. I hope that by giving you the text, you feel that I've pushed you way ahead of where you would be otherwise, because what I want you to do for the next few minutes is to play and to have fun with these different directives. What do you have available? You have the text of tutorial and guide all ready to be marked up. You have a quick reference, and you have little instruction manuals that I've written. Remember, earlier in your handout is a little set of instructions I wrote for what it's like to write this tutorial and what it's like to write the guide. Using those in the quick reference, see if you can start to make this plain, unmarked up text have the indentation. I unindented it, I was cruel, to see if you can get this indented and marked up. Even if in this class all you have time to do is the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, see if you can get things marked up so that they look, when you type make HTML, like they do when they are in the printed version that you have. I'm going to let this run, and this is sort of the main body of the second part of the tutorial. I think that we're going to do this for 20 or 30 minutes, depending on how far I see you guys are making it and whether you look like you're having a blast. What I'm going to do, I'm not, though, going to let you wallow for 20 minutes. I'm going to walk around, see how people are doing, and then about every 5 minutes I'm going to come up and just spend 1 minute doing some markup in front of you so that any of you who haven't figured out the next step, I'll kind of give it to you. So see how far you can get, but rest assured you're not going to sit here alone and wallowing for the next 20 minutes or 30 minutes. I'm every few minutes going to be getting up to the screen and moving everyone another step forward. I said, you'll remember, I wanted the word triangle to be a link to triangle-libshapes.triangle. So I spelled it like this, but told restructured text with a tilde that it could hide the first part of the name. And so restructured text put just the word triangle, but it's not clickable. I can't go anywhere by clicking on it, so it failed to actually find the cross-reference. Why is that? I went over to API and I found that I had misspelled the module name, and since I'm not using auto-module here, it didn't give me an import error because this is just dumb documentation that it just accepts what I type. And so triangle lib shape triangle, obviously in Python is not a match for triangle lib shapes triangle because Python considers 2 modules different if they differ by a letter. So I changed this to S. I said make HTML, and did that fix everything? No, because the make HTML process tries to be clever and only rebuild the docs that have changed. What doc changed when I edited api.rst? The API doc got rebuilt, but not the doc that was brokenly trying to refer to it. And this often happens to me with Sphinx. I'll look in a minute when I've given you your attention back to see. I wonder if there's something. Is there something? Yes. You can type make clean, and it will just destroy the entire build directory, thus forcing the next make HTML to build from scratch. If you ever try using a neat power of Sphinx, like let's say cross-referencing, and it doesn't work, before you waste your time on anything else, do a make clean make HTML, or maybe just set your shell up so that, you know, it does them together, make clean and make HTML, because as you can see, it is now a hyperlink. I can now click on triangle in the tutorial, and it takes the interested reader to my API docs, and it wouldn't be able to do that if if I had not forced it to rebuild all of the documentation. So make clean is useful a lot of the time when you're afraid that it's cached information from one document that now needs to be updated in another document. How are you doing at the moment? Are things kind of working? All right. Oh, thank you. Always when I walk away from the podium, feel free to tell me that I should bring another screen back up. Which is this one? Oh, or another tab of my browser? Which other one? Oh, thank you. Includes two different tick marks. And let me clarify that this tick mark, the one next to your enter or return key, is used all the time in text. It's an apostrophe. It's used as a single quote. It's used as the prime symbol next to mathematical numbers and operators. So there was no way that Sphinx was going to make that character special or an exception, because that would break so much of our typing habits in so many of our documents. But this character, which is in the probably upper left of your keyboard near the escape key, which is called the backtick, isn't used in normal English text at all, ever. And so, if you're just typing an email, typically you will never type that character. And so Sphinx felt free to override that and have that not be something you can type normally, but have it be a special markup character. And so a lot of this markup that you do in the middle of a paragraph, including the way that I showed you to build URLs when we went through the quick reference earlier, note that that uses backticks around it. Backticks because those are far more likely to stay out of the way of your typing. While I'm up here, I'll go a little farther in formatting the tutorial and note that the correct solution for making this code is first to indent it, but that doesn't completely solve the problem because indenting just makes a block quote, like our friend Euclid, so it looks like a paragraph. It is using a double quote because you're never likely to use that in normal text. That's the special signal to Sphinx to make this a colorized, syntax highlighted block of information. What if you don't want to end the paragraph with a colon? We don't always want to. I might just want to say, consider the following Python program and end with a period. What it lets you do is if you just break the double colon off the end of your paragraph and leave it dangling, Sphinx understands that you want the following block of indented information to be code, but it understands that you don't want a dangling colon out in the middle of the air after your paragraph. And of course, if you want one, you can always just add one in as a literal colon. I mean, it's not trying to say that it's impossible to have a colon sticking out here in the air, but the point is that it won't add it if you break the double colon off separately. Some people even code in a style where they do this because they get tired of trying to maintain that little double colon up at the last line of every paragraph. They hate that if they add a new line of a new sentence to the paragraph, suddenly they have to move the double colon down to keep their code block a block. And so they adopt a style like this where they just always put a little null paragraph here whose only content is the double colon in order to signal the presence of a code block that should be formatted beautifully. I'm hopping over to the guide for the moment to show you one or two things. Of course, triangle lib, you now from the tutorial know how you'll probably mark this up. Subtitles, remember, just put any kind of punctuation beneath the next title. And you don't have to have equals and dashes. You can use backticks and plus signs or whatever. I think you can use backticks. So you can plus signs, tildes, whatever you want. Restructured text leaves you in control. It simply assumes that whatever the first kind of underline it sees in the file is, must be the main title's underline. Whatever the second kind of underline it sees, well, that must be the second subsection kind of title you have. You're in complete control of the punctuation, and in fact, it even understands if you both over and under, and some people, I don't do this because I, for some reason, find it ugly, but some people do like the symmetry of putting the lines both above and below. Does that work? Why? Yes, it does. So here I've made this a subtitle simply by choosing a different, doesn't need to be bigger or look less impressive. Just by choosing a different kind of punctuation for this title, it is deduced that it must be a title of a subsection. Many of you have discovered that the that there's two problems that I challenged you with this little list of terms. Let me just do a fresh make HTML and then visit. I'll go back to the table of contents and then down into my guide. Oh, look, out in the table of contents, my little subtitle I made is now showing up. I love this. It's all like magic. But in order to make this like the printout, here are two steps. First, by indenting, and it doesn't matter how far, just like Python officially does not care how far you indent, so restructured text doesn't care. With that little indent, I am creating a dictionary term, dictionary title kind of format, but then I believe in your printout, it is actually, the terms are italicized, which I do here simply by manually putting little asterisks around them to make them italics. Note, one person ran into this, is that, remember, you don't use the double colons for doc test blocks because it understands doc test blocks. Doc tests that is, pasted in sessions from the Python prompt are obviously code because they start with 3 chevrons. No real paragraph would start with 3 chevrons. James Joyce never started a paragraph with 3 chevrons, and he was pretty out there. So because a paragraph in English, and hopefully not in other languages people use with Sphinx, because it can't start with 3 chevrons, you don't use the double colon with this kind of code block, and so you don't even have to indent it if the lines are a bit long and you want to keep them left justified. The chevrons make it safe to put that kind of code example right against the left margin.
Still not getting code blocks.
So the question was about code blocks. I put a double colon and then anything indented beneath it should become a block of formatted code. Where does my normal text begin again? Wherever my indentation level falls back to being lined up with the paragraph I had before. This means, by the way, that you can have code blocks in, what are they called? What was it called when we indent Euclid? Block quote. Here is a block quote. This is normal text, but we show code too. This is code because of the preceding double colon, but this is normal text because I'm back at the level of indentation of the paragraph that started the block quote. And if I have described the rules to you correctly, and if I've somehow typed that while talking without error, we get a block quote inside of which is a normal paragraph, a code paragraph, and then another normal paragraph. The rule for putting in code is that you put in is that you end a normal text paragraph with a double colon, and then everything is code and will not be touched until you get back to the level of indentation. Because, of course, the programming language that you've pasted into your document might use backtick, mightn't it? It might use any number of weird symbols, and you want all of those symbols to make it through intact into your output. And so the rule is, once that double colon has been reached and indented text starts to appear, it's all copied verbatim. Because it's code, Sphinx can't do any processing on it, because any character in there could be valid code in the programming language you're using.
Doing that, and I still don't get a block.
Let me look. Oh, I thought you meant you didn't understand what I was saying. You mean you're not getting one on the screen.
There's get and there's get.
Yeah, when he said, man, I'm not getting the block quote, I was like, okay, I will explain it again. You mean get as output. I'm sorry.
No. I like it.
Okay, show me it as not doing the block quote.
so,
Oh, it has to have a blank line under it. Because it has to end the paragraph. Another distinction that I need to mention, remember I said, and I didn't point out the significance of this, I said that you start a code block by ending a paragraph with a double colon. Is this point where my cursor is the end of a paragraph? Well, does it have a blank line beneath it? You were anticipating what I'm about to do. He was correctly answering the question I'm now asking. Is my cursor now positioned at the end of a paragraph? No. Paragraphs, just like in old-fashioned emails, are separated by blank lines. The double colon is only special if it ends a paragraph, because only by ending the paragraph, only by being at the end of the paragraph, does it control how the next paragraph, the next indented block of text, is handled. Guys, it has been so much fun watching you guys go from being people who might never have typed any restructured text to playing a little bit with Autodoc to then going in and doing this more sophisticated kind of markup that's letting you do cross-references into your API. One of the exercises a little later has you do a document reference between documents so that you can click on the title of a document mentioned by another and navigate there. But we're now getting towards the end where I had better show you the last few concepts that I promised to teach you before we finally run out of time. So here we go. This is, if you want to keep playing and keep typing, feel free to do so, because that gives you more questions that you can ask me right at the end. But guys, if you instead go home and maybe finish up marking up your tutorial or your guide later, You can ask me later this weekend a question about Sphinx. You can email it to me. You can ask it on Stack Overflow and ping me about it. I love that you guys have invested in the fact that PyCon provides these tutorials, which is always an iffy thing for them to do. They have to rent these rooms and stuff like this. But by magic, people in the Python community show up to this community-driven conference and are willing to invest extra in order to come make these tutorials happen and make them possible. And so I want to reward that, your investment in the community, not by cutting off 10 minutes after time is up and I've answered all of the immediate questions and disappearing for the rest of your lives and leaving you with any other typos, which I apologize for in advance, that you might find in my materials. I'm doing this today because I want Python programmers to be known as the best people in the industry. We have about 20 minutes left, by the way, and I'll watch that carefully. I want you guys to be the best. I want you guys to show up at workplaces, at schools where you might volunteer, at little organizations you might help out, and I want you to just be able to do magic. Pull data off the internet, mix it together, and display it in beautiful graphs. Our subject today. I want you to have tools that make it easy to write basic documentation for stuff, complete with cross-references and hyperlinks and auto-docked descriptions of your classes, because I hope that that will make you even more awesome people, offering even more awesome stuff for people that you work with and people that you volunteer with. And because my goal here is to get this tool being used better and more widely, I'm open to questions whenever. 6 months from now, 8 months from now, feel free to email me a question. Don't think that you need to squeeze a question into our last few minutes here in order to get it answered. If it occurs to you tomorrow, just come ask me, and I'll try to answer it. So with that stipulation having been made, so first, I'll just mention quickly doc tests. My documentation, much as I tried to make it perfect, apparently had at least 2 or 3 bugs in it today, and that's because it wasn't testable. I could misspell meth as method, and nothing flagged or signaled that the bottom of my quick reference was wrong. For when you have code in your file, there is a mechanism to flag errors, and it's called doc test. This will probably fail miserably because of how much I've been playing, and oh, no failures. Seriously? Oh my gosh. Okay, so I apparently have not, as I've been doing live examples, mangled this badly enough. When you say make doc test, and this is available because when you answered those questions and answers during the quick start, you said yes to doc test. If you forgot to or didn't and want to go back later, do you remember where you can go in? Conf.py, which, by the way, is explained if you just go into the Sphinx docs, jump to extensions, jump to Autodoc. The first thing it will say is go into your conf.py and add ext.autodoc. ext.doctest. What doctest does is it searches your code for all of these blocks that have triple chevrons in front, and it runs them. I want you to believe me, so let me introduce an error. 3 plus 3 is not 4. This should now say that I have 13 tests, and it should print out that one of them failed. It got 6, even though I was expecting 4. If you write documentation for your functions like this, then you will know before you distribute the documentation that you have made an error, because if you've typoed this or gone in and changed how the class works and it no longer matches, you'll now get 2 failures. This is really powerful, and this lets you clean up your document and always keep it in sync. Because one of the great problems with a software project is you write the documentation and then the developers run off and keep coding but don't keep the docs up to date, so they cease to reflect how you should actually import and use the API. This will save you from that. If you hate having chevrons in front of code, which I do, I hate having chevrons in front of code. Why do I hate having chevrons in front of code? Anyone guess? because then people can't cut and paste it into their own editor, into a .py file they're writing, without then backspacing over all of the chevrons. So Sphinx adds a neat ability to say test code, see if it intercepts print statements correctly, and test output. Again, this is one of those funny little directives, ... that introduces an indented block. And my idea is that there, if I've done this correctly, there should now be 14 tests with only the 4 and 6 failure that I created earlier, which I guess if I fix it, will stop being bothered by that. So if I accidentally have the test code not match the test output, then we get an exception. It expected high there, but it got simply high. And this is really, really powerful because it lets you, which document am I even working on? Guide. Okay, here it is. So if I hit, if I type make HTML and then hit reload, then you can see that the print high and the high there appeared as code blocks that I can cut and paste elsewhere without getting a bunch of chevrons shoved into somebody's file. So that's actually my favorite way of illustrating code, unless it's really little snippets that aren't really useful enough for someone to want to cut and paste. So that is a very powerful tool for keeping docs up to date. Going back to my slides, I talked about you could do community hosting, where you could do things where you could push your docs. I already showed you that your documentation can be served by any standard HTTP server that understands that like index.html should be what it displays when someone opens a directory. And you notice that in Apache or Nginx, any static content server, because that's the standard way things work, should work just like simple HTTP server did. You can always just batch copy the build HTML directory over to a web server, and your docs should appear if you've set the permissions correctly. But there's also services that will just host your docs for you. There's one called Python Hosted. It's actually used to be called packagespython.org, and it's you upload your package to PyPy, the Python package index, and then you go in and upload the zip file by hitting a button, and they'll host your docs. But what everyone is excited about these days is readthedocs.com. It has become hugely popular, well supported and awesome. It was written at the Django Dash. Here's a slide deck that kind of goes through its history if you're interested. But I will show you a story in 4 images of how I used it, and I did it last night to make sure that this was accurate. Let's see. I went to read the docs. I created a username. I entered a password. It let me create an account, and I got this page. It said, you don't have any projects. You should. And you see I put my cursor over create new docs on the site. I clicked that, and I got a page that said import an existing project. I said Brandon Sphinx tutorial. I gave the HTTP link to the repo on GitHub. Remember, all this tutorial information is free for you guys to use. It's up on GitHub. And I gave a little description. It then gave me this page and said your docs are currently being built. I waited for a minute. I hit reload, and then it gave me a link to read your docs, and this is what right now you can go see on the Read the Docs website. This tutorials handout, as I keep it updated over the months and fix any problems you see, all of those will get pushed live to the version of it that's up to be viewed on Read the Docs. So you can either go to my GitHub repo and see the source code, or you can come to Read the Docs and see the result and compare the two without even having to check it out and run Sphinx yourself, because that's what Read the Docs is. It's a big in-the-cloud Sphinx engine that knows how to run Sphinx. They install Sphinx so you don't have to. And it keeps it hosted. You really do want to install Sphinx yourself because, of course, it's annoying when you're trying to get something to work if you're having to check it in 20 times until you finally realize I misspelled a method name, so something's not working. But this makes it really easy if someone makes just a small change to documentation to automatically have it uploaded. When I then went, I was like, oh, I'm going to demonstrate to myself it's live. And I edited the docs a little and checked it in, and nothing changed. Because I had forgotten, the read the docs told me this, that I needed to go to GitHub, go to my admin settings service hooks, and there's all these service hooks. You can have services get push notifications whenever your code changes. So I had to go down, click on read the docs, .org. I clicked on update settings, and I went and reloaded the docs, and they looked the same. Because of course, once you're hooked up, a fresh check-in is necessary to kick off read the docs build process, but never fear, once it's active and you've turned it on, they always have, over to the right, you can almost see a test hook button that even though you haven't just checked something new in, goes ahead and pings all the services you've connected your repo to so that they all get a notification they need to rebuild your product, rerun your tests if you're using continuous integration. In this case, rebuild your docs. I then, as a fun bonus project, I added a git tag to one of my earlier versions called vo.1 because I'd noticed a lot of documentation these days on read the docs in the upper left has each version of the software that's been released, and you can just jump to the docs that are accurate for the version of the product you're using, and I wanted to see that too. So I created a tag, and nothing happened. So I went back over to read the docs to my control panel, and I found that it does not willy-nilly expose all of the dumb tag names you might create to the world by considering those different copies of the docs. You have to go in and turn on each tag you're interested in showing the world. You have to approve it as something that should be an official version of your documentation. And so when I went to my web browser and went to readthedocs.org, and it'll take a second to come up, and went to my dashboard and went to view docs for Brandon's Sphinx tutorial. There are now 2 versions in the upper left. You can either see version 0.1 or you can see latest, depending on which is the most interesting to you. So that is how hosting works. And again, you can always get to this tutorial's documentation at that URL and see what it looks like rendered. I think I need to change the theme. And so I have here in my slides, if you want to look later, how to tag something in Git, but I won't bore you all with that because I don't know how many of you use Git. Version controlling restructured text is pretty easy because, panic not, he has ended early. We still have 5 minutes. Have you ever taught a tutorial or given a talk, and like the guy next door ends early and everyone's like out the door? You know what I should have done? I should have just had you guys applaud me 8 minutes till and panicked him. For those of you who use version control, I will only say 2 things because I know that not all of you might be using it yet, though everyone should be, because if you don't have version control, it's like you're using an old drawing program with no undo, where if you accidentally draw over something, it's just gone and you've got to go rebuild the pixels by hand unless you've saved it. Having version control is like having undo for your documents and programs. If periodically when you finish some work, you're checking it in, you can always get back if it turns out you backspaced over a whole paragraph you had highlighted by accident. Restructured text. Generally, what you want to do is check in, oh, look how big my build directory is. You'll want to check in the make file, and you'll want to check in static templates and all of your normal files. What you will not want to check in is build, because build is just full of the temporary information that the build process creates. So omit that when you're doing version control. And also, you might want to be interested in my, I don't have time to explain it right now, But you'll note that the way that I did this documentation, I very often hit enter, not always, but I often hit enter when I'm done with a thought, rather than just, instead of here putting, going all the way to the end and then wrapping, I'll often wrap a little early if it means I can end a line with a sentence and have sort of one clause or phrase per line. This is an old trick that was developed around the same time as version control back at AT&T Bell Labs when Unix was first invented. By starting each sentence on a new line, by starting each sentence on a new line, you never get into the situation where all you did is add the word "the" to the end of that line, and now that whole line shows up as different in version control, because all version control sees typically is whether two lines match or not. And or, worse yet, the paragraph is going to stay the same, but you're going to add to the beginning of it, here is what comes next, colon. Well, when you then hit line wrap, this sentence will wrap differently, and the next sentence will wrap differently, and the next sentence will wrap differently, and you will see the entire paragraph as changed in version control because I added those 5 words at the front. If instead I had hit enter after the colon because I'm starting a new thought or idea and used new lines for the semantics, the meaning of what I was typing, then version control won't think the whole thing has changed. Obviously, there's a trade-off here. It'll be a little weirder to read my text file. The paragraphs won't look like a solid wide block if I'm breaking them early to make myself and version control happy. But another benefit of breaking early, if you still find the result readable when you open the restructured text file, a benefit is that a lot of editors, I'm thinking VI, I'm thinking Emacs, make it really quick to throw lines around. If each sentence is on its own line, all of your line-oriented editor commands become semantic, sentence-oriented commands. And that's very powerful. So that is my advice to you regarding version control. Keep build. Mark it as something that doesn't get version controlled under normal circumstances. And try to break lines in a way that doesn't make the whole paragraph look differently when you edit the top. I'm now ready for the thing I promised I would get to this year, which is theming. And I'm not as far behind as you might think because I've already shown you half of the theming talk. Half of the theming talk is that you have this great little file called conf.py, which has in it, as we found earlier in the section, look, it used lots of dashes, like it was written by the person who used restructured text. We have a big section called options for HTML output. The very first one is HTML theme, and what it does is it lets you name a theme, and your docs will then get built with it. You can go to the Sphinx documentation, and they have a page in the docs on the themes with a little picture of each one. That's a possible option. But in case you're not on the net at the moment that you want to know, and you'll see why I do this in a second, I usually just go look at the code, because right, this is Python. When we install things, the result is usually not that a big, ugly, opaque DLL gets dumped on our hard drive. The result of installing a Python package is normally that a bunch of friendly little .py files and their associated metadata get put on our hard drive. So if I look in this case I installed, you have to know where packages install on your system, and if you ask later I can help you figure that out. But if I look in the area where this installed, and look, and you'll learn this habit very quickly, /lib/version of Python /site packages, I can see all of the things that got installed when I installed Sphinx. You can see Sphinx itself, Jinja 2, Pigments, and docutils. And if I look in the Sphinx directory, that's its source code. I could open it. I am known for sometimes, if I'm really confused about what something is doing, I'll open its source code and add a print statement to see if I'm really calling the method I want. The problem sometimes is I forget to take it out. So a month later, I'll use a piece of software, and all this debugging will print because I forgot to reinstall it to make it clean. If you look inside of Sphinx, where would you guess that the themes are kept? You would just guess that they're in themes. If you look, do you recognize anything that looks familiar? Why, look, there's something called haiku. There's one called default, which is ugly and evil. Don't use it. And so while you can go to the Sphinx docs to see what these choices are, you can also list this directory. And as the final step, if you really want to take control yourself, I'm looking at the haiku directory. I notice it has, actually I'll use tree on it so that we see all the files in there. There's a static directory with some images. There's a cont file, and then there's a layout HTML. Wow, there's a static directory and some HTML, and what you'll find is that if you copy that layout HTML into your templates directory and copy the static files into your static directory, in some cases, and I can show you those of you that are interested later, but with a little tweaking, you will be running off of not the haiku that comes with Sphinx. You'll be running off of your own copy that you can start modifying, retheming, hand to your graphic designer, and if you keep static and templates and version control, that styling will travel around with you and appear on Read the Docs when it builds the documentation. That is how you theme. Thank you very much for your patience, for your support of PyCon by doing this extra, and I hope you have an incredible conference. Thank you very much. And I'll probably actually just do PDF, because that's the main other one people ask about. And once you know how to do that one, you will know the procedure for looking up and generating the other kinds. There's probably one or two other kinds I'll do. I just don't remember their names at the moment. Anyone else? Okay. Okay. I was going to say something, and I can't remember what it is at the moment. So, this is your Sphinx tutorial handout. Yeah, the problem is that I'm holding theirs up as the example. Who will I be giving this to in a moment when I get done? All right, it will go to you. I will try not to get it messy. This is Brandon's Sphinx tutorial. The handout might actually be more useful if you rip it in pieces, which I would illustrate had there been an extra, but I'm not going to do it to his. I will leave it up to him. After the first 3 pages of opening, oh, wait a minute, no, it numbers them from 0. So let me say that page number, let's see, page number 9. So let me just take you through this, because this is going to be, I handcrafted this handout for the way that we're going to be going through the material today in the tutorial. And so I need, because this is a resource you'll be drawing on, especially if I've moved on to a topic that you're still confused about, let me briefly take you through the chapters. Chapter 3 is the basic outline of how you run Sphinx. It looks scary because the chapter is 7 pages, but if you will note, the actual instructions for running Sphinx actually only cover pages 3 and 4, and by the time you get to page 5, you're starting to get to the rest of the material, the fancier stuff that I'm going to teach you today. But I tried in the between pages 3 and 7 really here, I tried to boil down all the major hints and tips I'm going to be giving you today, so that besides the video that's being recorded, you will have a printed reference to the kind of things I'm telling you. Most of the back of the chapter is what you'll want to refer to later when you're trying to get all this to work. And, you know, tomorrow when you get home, you're trying to write some stuff. And of course, because I'm not there, it won't work. And this is how you can get back to my thoughts on the subject. Much more the concepts of Sphinx. I would show them what it's like to write a tutorial, and then I would invite them to do it for Triangle Lib. Guess what they spent a lot of their time doing? Trying to figure out Triangle Lib and what it did. trying to write. I mean, I guess I turned it into kind of an essay, a writing class. You started with a blank sheet of paper and had to just document this little module I gave you. And I mean, it is a very little module. Most people managed it. But I realized that that took people's focus off of the mechanics of Sphinx. What is it doing for me? How does it work? There were a lot of topics I couldn't cover because people spent all of their time trying to figure out how the module worked and think up words of their own. Sorry. To think up words of their own to describe it, which is tough. It can take all day to write a good little tutorial. And I realized that you'll learn the same Sphinx mechanics whether I provide the words or you do. You'll learn all the same mechanics if you just type in documentation I've already invented. So if you're especially creative, if you're a designer, English major, if you took Latin in high school, and you just don't like the constraint of writing up the triangle lib tutorial exactly as I have it here, feel free to go off program, write your own paragraphs, explain it your own way. Do try to reproduce all of the features, the code blocks and things I've put here, because that's what we're actually trying to learn. But if what you're here for today is to learn how Sphinx works, this is your goal. I've already written documentation for triangle lib, and you are going to each open an empty file in a minute. We're going to start, interestingly enough, with the last piece over on page 23. I'm going to start you. You're going to open api.rst, a blank file, and you're going to try to make this documentation appear from nowhere. I will note that, though I will be leading you through instructions for doing that, the 3 chapters we just skipped over on page 15, writing tutorial RST. Previous to that, page 13, writing API from RST. Oh, and then I guess right after that, 17, writing guide.rst. Pages 13, pages 15. Welcome to the 2013 incarnation of the Sphinx tutorial. I gave it initially, I think, about 4 years ago, tweaked it in subsequent years, and then have nearly rewritten it for this year because I've been learning better and better what makes a tutorial work for students. So hopefully those of you who have heard about it from friends will be able to go back and tell them that your experience was even more interesting, because I think we're going to pack a good bit more material in here than I was able to in previous years. Let me quickly outline what I'm intending to cover over the course of the tutorial, because it could be that some of you have come in with a need or a desire or something you need to get done that I hadn't even thought of. And it could be that if you mention it now and I have it in the back of my mind, that I can later in the class include at least a little 5-minute spiel on whatever topic you are interested in. So let me say that I'm kind of imagining this class as the material I have prepared is in 2 halves. Writing documentation, we will look at having it generated automatically, handcrafting it ourselves about how to think about tutorial introductions that people need to our software, and topical guides. And after that first half of the class, or it might run over into the second half, that's sort of the core. How do you write documentation using Sphinx? What are the mechanics? And then how might you think about organizing your documents? We're going to talk about deployments. Serving it as static HTML, having it hosted automatically on Read the Docs, hints, tips, and thoughts about storing it in version control, and then this year, for the first time, I am fitting in a segment on theming the HTML version so that it doesn't look terrible and misleading like the default theme does. If I cover those topics, will most of you have had hit sort of the basic topics that you showed up for? Are there any things that you guys had in your mind I would cover that you want to mention because you think it falls outside of this and I maybe should include a few minutes on something else? Sir.
Generating other output formats?
Besides HTML. And so when I say, I will go ahead, because actually I was gonna, that was as we wrote, I was gonna have us produce some different, but I should make that explicit. And pages 17 are essentially our curriculum for the first half and part of the second half of the tutorial. And so what I have packaged here is the complete documentation for a little Python package and instructions for how to start with a blank file and make that documentation happen on your own. I have quick references to all of the syntax that I will be covering, and that's the first thing we'll go over in a minute. And so your goal, which is to produce the documentation, is going to be supported by the quick references that will let you remember all of the different Sphinx constructs I show you, by my own voice, because I will stand up, we'll open an empty file called api.rst together, and I'll start leading you through it. And that process I'm taking you through is written out for your current and future reference in Chapter 4, writing api.rst. So if you fall behind or want to go back through this whole process later, I essentially have the whole exercises part of the tutorial, including all the stuff I'll say as an instructor, in this document. Quick references for the syntax, these writing guides to help you understand how you go from an empty file to each of these 3 target chapters, and the target chapters themselves, so that you're not having to invent content off the top of your head, but so that you have a process for creating each of these documents. The reason I thought that you might want to rip this into small pieces and dismember it is because when you're writing api.rst, I would want to rip out the quick references, so they were on one side of my keyboard, and I would want to rip out the guide to writing api.rst and the text of api.rst to sit next to me, so that all of those things were in view, because the codex, the book, was a great invention. Scrolls required, essentially, if the passage you wanted to get to in a scroll was 30 meters down the scroll, you had to sit there and wind in order to reach. So random access of a scroll was like a disk drive, having to move a disk head back and forth, and it could take time. When they decided in the 1st and 2nd century to start chopping beautiful books, irrelevant for today, is page 9. As you go through the tutorial, you might be tempted to and might decide to just carefully rip this page out so that you can have it sitting next to your other materials. This is a quick reference we're about to read through to how one types restructured text. Pages 11 and 12, a double-sided page that follows it, is also a, if you wish, rip-outable quick reference with all of the constructs you will need for our exercises today that are Sphinx constructs. And don't worry, I'll talk about what those 2 things are in a minute. I then, in chapters 4, 5, and 6, which are a single sheet of paper each, have some instructions that, with my jumping in and leading you through it as well, is going to help you today write the documentation on pages 19 through 24. Pages 19 through 24, I very carefully put the name example in front of the titles of each of those chapters. The 3 example chapters are documentation for a little library called Triangle Lib. I wrote it myself. And what you are going to be doing today is creating this little booklet, these 3 chapters, using Sphinx. And in fact, we'll probably be most of the way done by soon after the break. There is a break in the middle of the tutorial, which is especially nice if you're thirsty, need coffee, or have fallen behind, and I and the TAs, especially during that time where the TAs aren't talking over me, we can really help you catch up if you've if a technicality or something has caught you and made you miss one of the goals. So the goal today is for you to learn a lot about Sphinx, to have a lot of fun, to learn a lot about deployment and about where you keep your docs and where you put your documentation so that people can read it. And the really concrete goal is for you right here, live on your laptops, to learn how to produce a little set of documentation like this. Now, I'll go ahead and I will admit what my error was in earlier years. Do you know what I did the very first time I gave this tutorial? I gave people triangle lib, and as I went through introducing